It's been called one of the most beautiful fonts ever made. In fact, I tend to think it is. It's called Palatino. It's on your computer right now, and it's got an interesting history. Ready to find out more about it? Hi, I'm Stuart. I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, and I hope that you'll take the journey with me. I've been doing a series on the basic fonts that were included on Apple and Microsoft computers in the 1990s and kind of form the basis, just the bottom level of all the fonts that we tend to see in use today. I'll put links to the other videos in the description. I hope that you have a chance to watch those as well. Today I'm talking about Palatino. And Palatino is one of those interesting stories because it's tied to a particular person, a person who honestly was with us until 2015. This is not a story of somebody who's passed away a long time ago. This is Hermann Zapf. Hermann Zapf was a German who was born during the First World War. He grew up not particularly wealthy, and he became a trade union supporter, which right away, even as a young person, kind of made him very unpopular with the folks who were ruling Germany at the time. One of the things about fascism, I'm going off way on a tangent here, is that fascists don't get along with trade unions. They don't get along with anything that even vaguely smacks of what we would call socialism. And so Zapf found himself in a concentration camp as a young person. He had trouble working, he did everything that he could, and throughout this, he discovered a love for letters and a love for writing, and he got very good at writing, and eventually became a typeface designer. Of course, it was not a linear road. Just as he was starting to kind of get into the typeface designing, well, the Germans started getting into some trouble of their own in, 1939. Hermann Zapf, being the right age and being male, and that's what you were in those days if you went in the army, he got drafted. And luckily for him, he made it through unscathed, although he was captured as a prisoner of war. He was in a French POW camp for about a month after World War II, and by the time he got out, he was able to get back into designing type. But I'm mentioning all of this because Zapf had this idea for type that was different from what everybody else was doing, and he based it on something that he'd never actually laid eyes on. Starting in the 1930s, what you saw was this movement toward what they call geometric type. A perfect example of this is Futura. If you take a look at Futura, the entire font is mostly the same in its stroke. It looks very even, as if it were done with a paintbrush. And this geometric style was viewed as very modern in the 1930s. And it continued to dominate. Actually, it honestly still kind of dominates today. And geometric sans serifs are found everywhere, especially Helvetica and Arial, which I talk about in another video. Zapf didn't particularly care for geometric fonts. He liked kind of the opposite. And he was really very in love with the type designers of the 1600s and 1700s, like Caslon and Bedoni, who did work where the strokes were very ornate, where there was a lot of decoration, and where the fonts themselves had a real kind of variety in the way that they looked. And so he set out to design fonts that looked the way he thought that fonts should look. And the first thing he did was design a set of fonts based on Italian calligraphy. This was a bit of a problem for Zapf because he had never been to Italy. He'd never seen a lot of the source work that had been done with Italian fonts going all the way back to the days of the Roman Empire. And yet he'd had this idea because he'd seen photos, he'd seen engravings, he'd seen all sorts of things that pointed him in the right direction. The first font that he came out with in his humanist series was called Palatino. It was named Palatino after a famous Italian calligrapher named Palatino. And as I said, Zapf never saw his work in person until long after the font was done. Zapf designed the font for metal type, because remember, this was the 1940s, and that's how stuff was done then. And the ornateness of this font made it very hard to produce. It was eventually picked up by the Stempel type foundry, and its journey continues from there. Palatino is just a beautiful font. It has features that other fonts do not have. If you take a look at the capital Y, it's a very antique-looking capital Y. The italics look very calligraphic in their nature, and the whole font itself just has the image of somebody writing by hand, except done even better. And Palatino was not really an immediate hit, because the world was still enthralled by geometric fonts, but it was one of those fonts that kind of grew and grew and grew in popularity, to the point that by the time the computer revolution started, it was kind of one of those must-have fonts. The linotype version of Palatino was one of the first fonts that was included with the Apple Laser Writer back in the early 1980s. It was the first printer that used the PostScript font language. And at that point, it became very, very accessible to a new generation of designers. People discovered it for the first time, and it became very popular, especially compared to some of the other types that were there and maybe were not as useful as Palatino in its own way. The next chapter in Palatino's life comes down to the early 1990s, when Microsoft was specifying types to be used in Windows 3.1, which was going to be the competitor to the Macintosh operating system. Microsoft famously decreed that every font in the original PostScript set had to have a version on Microsoft Windows that laid out exactly the same way, letter for letter. And this is where we get Arial, it's where we get Times New Roman, Century Schoolbook, and a whole bunch of others. And Palatino. Microsoft called its first version of Palatino Book Antiqua, because, well, they didn't have the right to use the name Palatino. In the United States and in other countries, you can copyright the name of a font, you can copyright the computer code that's used to make it, if it's like computery or something like that, or any manufacturing methods, but you cannot copyright its appearance. So you're free to take a printed version of something like Palatino, make your own digital file of it, and bingo bango, as long as you don't call it Palatino, you'll be all set. There were other companies that did this as well. Palatino was known as Palladio in some cases. It was known as Zapf Calligraphic in some cases. Wherever you saw it, it was still Palatino. It was still very recognizable. And unlike fonts like Arial and Century Gothic, well, it was actually kind of a one-for-one, almost identical to Palatino. Only the finest eye could differentiate between something like Book Antiqua and true Palatino. Book Antiqua was replaced in the 21st century by Palatino Linotype, which is probably the font that's on your computer right now. The differences between Apple Palatino and Palatino Linotype are so small that I personally cannot tell the difference. Let me put it that way. But I'm sure there are differences. It's just that similar. It just is. By that time, Linotype had bought a bunch of other font foundries. They had bought Monotype, who was the font supplier for Microsoft, and so they were able to include the original version of Palatino as kind of the replacement for Book Antiqua. This pleased Hermann Zapf a lot, who has famously asked that Book Antiqua be completely forgotten. He considers it a bastardization of the font that he created, doesn't like it at all. Us regular humans, as I said, can barely tell the difference. The story of Palatino goes on and on and on. Hermann Zapf went on to create some of the most recognizable fonts in the world, notably Optima, which you know as the font that's on literally every sign in every hotel in Las Vegas, and Zapf Dingbats, which was used to create things like the check mark and the pointer picture. Before that we had GIFs or emoji, we had Zapf dingbats. And Hermann Zapf is recognized as one of the great font designers of all time for having done things like that. I recommend people use Palatino whenever they possibly can. It's a little wider in most cases than Times New Roman. It's not as wide as Bookman Old Style, but it just gives a certain sense of class to anything that you're typing. Unfortunately, some of the early designs for Palatino, which had beautiful swash letters, were not carried over into digital type, but it's still, by itself, it's a beautiful font. And I hope that you check out Palatino Linotype on your own computer. Type a bunch of stuff with it, see how it looks, see how it compares to something like Times Roman, and see how you feel just kind of reading it. I think you'll feel a little bit classier, and that's kind of what Hermann Zapf had in mind. That's it for the Middle Aged Hack channel for today. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, leave a comment. I hope that you do, because I am trying to build this channel up. I can't do it without your help, and it's just as simple as that. I make videos about the things that I like, and I hope that you like them too. And the only way that I know is if you tell me. Have a great day, and happy typing.